Hi, in this video we will be talking about our next camera setting, which is aperture. Aperture is what controls the depth of field in our photos. Here is the exposure triangle that we all know and love, right? As you can recall from when we talked about shutter speed, the exposure triangle shows us how interconnected these camera settings are. We cannot adjust the aperture without affecting our other camera settings. So when we are looking at aperture on our exposure triangle, we see that we can go from a high f number to a low f number. A high f number results in deeper depth of field. A lower f number results in a shallower depth of field. So let me show you what I mean. The first photo here shows an example of shallow depth of field. The branch is in focus, or more accurately, part of the branch is in focus, but everything in the background is nicely blurred out. Doing so emphasizes certain parts of my image, so in this case, the branch. The photo had a low f number. The lowest f number you can use depends on the certain lens that you are using. Some lenses go down as low as f1 and even a little bit lower than that, but a lot of lenses, including the ones that you have on the cameras we supplied to you, they go down to about the 4.0 range. This next photo is an example of a deeper depth of field. I took this photo standing on the Bismarck side of the Missouri River, but everything is pretty well in focus from where I am standing all the way over to the Mandan side. So that's a nice and deep depth of field. The F number was set a lot higher in this one than it was in the first one. So enough of my examples, let's have you practice. You are again going to take some photos just like you did for the previous activity. This time you will need 3 objects for your photos. As you can see here, for this one I use my coffee mug, my water bottle, and my travel mug. You can use objects similar to these where they are not all the same, or you can use 3 of the same objects, which is what I did actually for this activity. But before we talk too much about that, let's get our camera set up the way we need it. If it's not already set to manual on the mode dial, do that. Make sure, as before, that your lens is set to autofocus and not manual focus, and the stabilizer should still be on from before. Set your shutter speed to 1/160th of a second. To adjust this, don't forget that you just turn the main dial. And just a reminder, we know what setting we're adjusting because of those orange arrows right there. We also need to adjust the ISO. We want ours set to auto for this activity. To adjust the ISO, press this button right here. That should take you to this screen. Once you get to that screen, turn the main dial to adjust the ISO to auto. Now let's adjust the aperture. We want to start out at f5.6 for this activity. The lowest it will go, again, will depend on the lens, but also keep in mind that the amount that you have that lens zoomed in will also affect the aperture that you are able to set. And again, just another reminder, the lower the f number, the shallower the depth of field. We also call this a narrow plane of focus. So if there's a shallow depth of field, that's a narrow plane of focus. To adjust the aperture, you need to press and hold this button right here in the back. When you press and hold that button, the little orange arrow should move over to the next box where you see the f6.3 on mine. This is the aperture. And again, aperture controls the depth of field, which we abbreviate as DOF. Okay, before we can take our photos, there is one more thing that we need to adjust. Instead of letting the camera decide where to focus, we're actually going to tell it where to focus. We need to set the AF point selection to just the center dot. To adjust where the camera will be focusing, push this button right here. You will want the center box to be highlighted in yellow just like this. Press the set button and it should toggle from automatic selection to manual selection. Once you have set it to manual selection, if you want to change which individual box will be the focus point, you can use these buttons to move it around. Right there. Now that we have all of our camera settings figured out, let's set up our still life. Like I mentioned earlier, you need 3 objects for this activity. There shouldn't be a lot going on in the background, so it's a good idea to clear the area or move to a different area where there's not a lot in the background. but you need to place your three objects approximately 12 inches or 1 foot apart in a line. You can use a ruler or a yardstick if you want to, like I did here in my picture, but you don't necessarily have to do that. You can also just estimate. So try to do a good job of estimating approximately 1 foot in between each object. I'm showing you my setup here from above, but keep in mind that I will be taking my photos from directly in front of my object. So I'm not going to be taking my photos from above. I am going to be taking them from right here where this little smiley face is. So from that point, my subjects are all in a line in front of me. One is about 12 inches in front of the camera, one is 12 inches behind that, and then the third is another 12 inches behind that one. They are not set up side by side. This part is super important for this activity. So they are not all in a line going this way. They are in a line here, and my camera will be here. Okay, finally, we are ready to take some photos. You will be focusing on the middle object for all of your photos for this activity. Don't forget, this is exactly why we went to the trouble of changing the way our camera focuses. So for this first photo, I am going to use the settings that I just established. My shutter speed is set to 1/160th of a second. ISO is set to auto, so that means the camera should automatically adjust for the lighting in the room. But since we're in manual mode, the camera's built-in flash still shouldn't be popping up, and that's exactly what we want. You do, again, just like the previous activity, you need some natural light in the room that you're taking these photos. The aperture for this first photo is set to f5.6. The aperture will be the only thing that we will change from one photo to the next for this series of photos. So when you take this first photo, your middle object should be in focus, but this first object should be out of focus, as should the last object. So again, you can see the angle that I'm taking my photos at. I am focusing on this middle object right here. The first one is out of focus and the last one is out of focus, but my middle one is in focus. Okay, in this next slide, this is all the same setup. I just zoomed in on my object a little bit more than in my first one. Here you can pretty clearly see that my middle object is in focus, but my first object and my last object are out of focus. Okay, so moving on to my second photo. For this one, I kept all of my camera settings the same, except I changed the aperture from f5.6 to f6.3. Again, when I'm taking my photo, I'm focusing on the middle object. And again, just a reminder, I have all three of my objects set up away from me. So the first one is closest to me, the second one is a little bit farther away from me, and the third one is a little bit farther away than that. In this photo, my middle object is again in focus. My first object is out of focus, and my third object is still out of focus. Okay, so here is my third photo. Again, don't forget that you're focusing on the middle object in all of these photos. For this one, my shutter speed and my ISO have not changed, but I bumped my aperture up to f8.0. So now my middle object is still in focus, my first object is out of focus, and my third object is still out of focus, but is getting a little bit closer to being in focus. So now we're going to start seeing some changes in our plane of focus, which is our depth of field again, which is all controlled by our aperture. So let's keep going with that. Here is my fourth photo. Shutter speed and ISO have again stayed the exact same as before. Aperture is now f11. Middle object is in focus. Are you seeing a theme yet here? First object is still pretty blurry, and my third object is actually kind of in focus. Okay, fifth photo, still kept my shutter speed and ISO the same, but I have changed my aperture to f13. Middle object is yet again in focus. This isn't going to change in case you haven't figured that out by now. My first object though was always out of focus before, but now it's starting to get a little closer to being in focus. And then my third object is pretty much in focus. So not quite as clear as my middle object, but a heck of a lot closer than in my first photo with my aperture set to f5.6. So for my next photo, we're seeing these effects even more pronounced. Again, shutter speed and ISO remain constant, but I did change the aperture to f16. Middle object is again in focus, no surprise there, but my first object is even closer to being in focus, and my third object should be very close to in focus. Now for my seventh and final photo, my shutter speed and ISO have not changed, but my aperture is set to f20. Middle object is in focus, first object is getting even closer to being in focus, and my third object is pretty well in focus. So there you go. Those are all of the photos I need to take for this exercise. And now we're back to our trusty exposure triangle. Keep in mind that when I'm going from a lower f number for my aperture up to a higher f number, that affects the exposure. So when I'm making these changes, I need to compensate for that in my other camera settings. That's why we had our ISO set to auto for this exercise. So the camera would do that for us just a bit. But here, let's look at the photos I just took. This one with the highest f number is the one with the most in focus. My next one has slightly less in focus, and so on, and so on, and so on. And as you can see when I put them together, that even when I'm hoping that setting my ISO to auto to compensate for the aperture changes, it's kind of works, but not perfectly. My photos taken at a higher f number are still a little bit darker than the ones I have taken at a lower f number. So these are definitely darker than these up here. Okay, so now what you need to do and hand in for this activity, you need to take 7 photos as I did, one at each of the following apertures: f 5.6, 6.3, 8, 11, 13, 16, and 20. You need to put them together into a Google slide presentation in order with labels telling me what settings you use for each of your photos. For all of your camera settings, so shutter speed, ISO, and aperture for each of those photos. And then you need to submit that in Classroom. And pretty soon you are going to be photographers who can handle any sort of setting you ever need to take photos in. Okay, that is it. Go ahead and take your photos. If you have questions, send them my way. See ya.